now we're starting the fourth and last part of this expanded autobiography, and in this fourth part I will project my idea of the development of human society into the future. I was wondering, perhaps you are wondering, what this strange object which is before me is, and it is a very interesting object because it is a primitive use was as a fly chaser, in French chasse-mouche, but it became in the hands of Zhao Zhou a symbol of his authority, and the fact that I possess it, that I have this object, indicates that I am in his lineage, and that fact is a very something of which I'm very proud, and the object, of course, is my proudest possession. He used to hit the students with it when they gave the wrong answer, and when they gave the right answer, he would invite them to have a cup of tea with him. Now, how can we predict the future? Well, scientifically, in observing the past, it's like the trajectory of a ball or a missile. When you have all the coordinates of the trajectory, you know exactly where the missile or the ball is going to land. And this is what people who play ball games, football, basketball, baseball, and so forth, it's exactly the skill that they use automatically when they run to catch or hit one of these balls. So we can predict what the Judeo-Christian Islamic system is going to do from what it's done in the past. Now, I would suggest that anyone who has not carefully listened to the first part do so before they listen to this part, because otherwise it might be quite mystifying. What I'm saying is that the Judeo-Christian Islamic system is expansionist and aggressive. And it's an interesting coincidence that this weekend's Financial Times talked about a future war with China. Well, I think this is rather surprising that a newspaper would have such an article which assumes as a matter of course that such a war is inevitable, but nevertheless, I agree with them. I think it's in the nature of the Judeo-Christian Islamic system, as I said, aggressive and expansionist, should target the last civilization still existing on the planet Earth, and which can't be allowed to continue. Why? Because it's an unbelievable success, and it shows up a country like the United States, which is a heartland like Israel, a heartland of the Judeo-Christian Islamic system. And this system cannot compete with civilizations such as the Chinese civilization. Therefore, there's only one possibility, that it destroys that system to avoid an unfavorable comparison with their system. Now, the question is not what will happen, but how it will happen. I think that Russia will play the role in this future war that Italy played in the Second World War. That is, I think Adolf Hitler once said that everything he knew about fascism he had learned from Benito Mussolini. And you might say that Italy was the, they say in a slaughterhouse, they sometimes have an animal who leads the other animals into the slaughterhouse, and in fact, they come out alive on the other side, but the other animals don't. And that was somewhat the role of Italy, and showing Germany how fascism works. And in fact, it worked quite well in Italy, and that was necessary for the plan to work. As the saying goes, whatever the shortcomings of Mussolini's El Duce's Italy, the trains ran on time. So it's difficult. I once read a CIA report, confidential report, I think it was even marked secret, on China and the possibility of conquering China. And the bottom line was that China's possibly unconquerable because of its large size and the fact that the Chinese fight very well for their territory. But it is a fact that Chinese troops do not fight very well outside of China. And we had recent proof just after the end of the America's involvement in Vietnam. The Chinese decided to settle their border dispute with Vietnam by force and sent the Chinese army into northern Vietnam. And the result was one of the most violent battles in the history of humanity. And the result was that the Chinese army withdrew because the Vietnamese army was fighting for its own, what it considered its own territory. So, of course, there's no way to predict exactly how events will be manipulated in order to justify a war with China. It's of course, logically, it's completely ridiculous because China has always been on the side of Western European nations. I don't know how many thousand Chinese soldiers died in France in the First World War and are buried in cemeteries in France. And inevitably, when the Chinese ambassador, new Chinese ambassador comes to France, he goes around and visits these places where the Chinese flag floats over the graves of the Chinese soldiers. China has always consistently been on the side of Western European countries, and there is absolutely no sound reasoning that makes China our enemy. And in contrast, Japan, of course, attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor, attacked without declaring war, and a surprise attack, very dishonorable. And there was a film made about it, and in the film, the Japanese admiral says, "They will never forgive us for this act of treachery." And in fact, we've not only forgiven Japan, but we pretend that Japan is our friend. Well, I think it's a good idea to be friends with everybody, but the idea that Japan and not China is our friend in the Pacific won't stand up to historical analysis. It's interesting that even Japan is not convinced and is now trying to draw closer to China, realizing that probably in the long run, China is going to run the Far East and not the United States, certainly not the United States of Trump. As you may have noticed, the recent event, the trip of the Japanese Prime Minister to China, and they signed a lot of agreements drawing the two countries closer together. It's interesting to notice how the culture follows the culture of the Judeo-Christian Islamic system follows the plan, what you might call the battle plan. And everywhere you look, Japan is presented favorably, and China is presented unfavorably, even though there's no objective grounds for such a differentiation. The Financial Times article about China as a potential enemy and in an inevitable war was supported by a picture of the Chinese president in battle fatigues on board a Chinese ship in the South China Sea, suggesting, of course, the picture didn't require a caption. It suggests that the Chinese are have an esprit aggressive and are looking for trouble and want a war. In fact, that's complete nonsense, and it's obvious that it's nonsense because China is winning the trade war with the United States, and the proof is that Trump is talking about winding down this operation. Of course, and he wouldn't be doing that if he were winning. In fact, to everyone's surprise and amazement, Chinese exports have not gone down. They've simply switched to other markets, which, as a centrally controlled economy, that's their big advantage. They do these things in a rational and a systematic manner, whereas the United States is more or less haphazardly going from one crisis to another. Well, to get back to the CIA report on China, which said it was probably unconquerable, but of course this report was based on weapons systems of the 1950s, and of course the situation is very definitely changed today. Now, the question is the United States overextended? According to the article, hold on to your hat, the United States has soldiers in 177 countries. Well, that's a lot of countries by any, and of course some places they only have a small amount of soldiers, but nevertheless, the United States can be seen as overextended, especially if it's losing, as it seems to be, losing the trade war with China. So I would say the result of analyzing all of this is that China does not want a war, and it will manipulate the situation such that the war will be pushed back as long as possible, because China's becoming stronger, the United States is not becoming stronger, and therefore the match between them is becoming, the progression is in the direction of favoring China. So China will not precipitate a war. That's my first prediction. But people in the United States are not stupid. I'm not the only one that sees the increasing advantage of China as a menace. Certainly, China will not attack the West. For one thing, if you look at the map, China has no way of attacking the West unless it launched intercontinental ballistic missiles against the United States. Obviously, they will not do that because they would probably lose on an exchange. It's very interesting to observe the Chinese rationalism. For example, I think the United States has something like 9,000 intercontinental ballistic missiles with multiple warheads, and China has 390. Now, the Chinese, you might say, well, this is ridiculous. China's obviously going to lose. But is it? Because the Chinese reasoning seems to be, of course they don't talk about it, but it seems to be that beyond a certain number of missiles, it doesn't make any difference, because if you can destroy, say, 30 of the major cities of the opponent, then what difference does it make if you destroy these cities 2, 3, 4 times over? There's no point. And the Chinese seem to have learned that and saved the money. They're also shifting from all-out weapons like intercontinental ballistic missiles, etc., mass destruction, weapons of mass destruction, in favor of conventional weapons in their aircraft and their ships. They bought a half-completed aircraft carrier from Russia, and they've completed it, and it's now operational. It has planes taking off and landing on it. And they have also launched, now they have a second aircraft carrier that was entirely home-built in China, and so they now have 2 aircraft carriers. You might say, well, when you compare that with 13 aircraft carriers of the United States, it's not very many, but the 13 aircraft carriers of the United States have to be spread over the entire world. And when you do that, you realize that the Western Pacific gets 2 or maximum 3 aircraft carriers. So the amount of aircraft carriers in the potential Chinese war zone is about the same between the United States and China, and this balance is constantly moving in the direction of China. So it's difficult to see. I would, if I were part of the Chinese leadership, I would argue in favor of absorbing Taiwan. Is America ready to go to war over Taiwan? Maybe, maybe not. Taiwan is a long way away. They're Chinese, they speak Chinese, and they have become diplomatically isolated. And this isolation has gotten worse recently, despite the fact that Taiwan has tried desperately to consolidate and increase the number of countries that recognize Taiwan as China. The actual fact is that the majority of countries that Taiwan has recently put pressure on to remain in their camp. Several have gone over to Beijing. It's quite obvious when you compare the statistics of Taiwan and the mainland why this is the case. China is and does propose substantial financial inducements for these countries to continue to align with or to abandon Taiwan and to align with mainland China. And this tendency will probably continue. The area of the world in which it's most evident is Africa. You might say, as far as Black Africa is concerned, it's practically a Chinese takeover. The Chinese have been, as usual, very clever. First of all, unlike the Americans, they don't mix in local politics. They don't care how corrupt the local dictator is. They cooperate with them, and they pose no danger to the local dictators, which America definitely does with its program of advancing democracy and so forth. And that's one aspect. And the second aspect is that China has an enormous trade surplus, and they can practically give away at prices that the underdeveloped countries cannot refuse. And the third element of the Chinese penetration is the fact the Chinese do not lend money. And this might sound like, well, then they can't get anywhere, can they? Well, no, they can get everywhere, because what they're doing is truck. They're taking out raw materials that are cheap and abundant in Africa, and they're giving manufactured goods, Chinese manufactured goods, in return. And the result is the third world countries in Africa, which of course have become frequently very indebted to the United States, are not becoming indebted to China, and that's very attractive to them, because of course having a heavy burden of debt is not desirable. During a recent trip in Africa, I saw somebody riding a small motorcycle, and I noticed that the brand name was Chinese. And so I stopped the African and I asked him why he'd bought a Chinese motorcycle. And he answered this way: they're not as good as the Japanese motorcycles, but they're much, much cheaper. And so that determined my purchase. And that's another advantage of the Chinese. They're making not very good manufactured goods, but that are accessible by their price to African countries, where the price is the most significant thing. So I see this as this trade maneuvering of the Chinese, the fruits of which have recently been noted by the fact that despite the trade war with the United States, Chinese exports are not going down. And of course that means that in more or less, and also President Trump has implicitly admitted that he has to come to terms with China, and therefore we can say that the best the Americans will get out of the trade war is a draw. And in fact, a draw with the United States is, of course, a Chinese victory. And this means that this is where the movement from trade to military uh, will come when those in the United States, which are fundamentally anti-Chinese, what was called the China lobby, that is the anti-China lobby, will move to military, and in fact, this is already starting to happen, and it's another indication that America realizes that it is losing the trade war, because the American press is pointing out that America military is seriously behind both Russia and China, and a war with either one could easily go against America, so that America's military spending must go up dramatically. And this, again, is a negative thing for the United States, because one of the things that brought down the Soviet Union was its arms race with the United States. The Soviet Union was spending so much on armament that the benefits of the socialist system of production was not going to make the lives of people better. It was going to produce planes and tanks and so forth for the armed forces. And this is one of the reasons that life in East Germany became less interesting than in West Germany, and people were climbing over the wall to get into Western Germany. So I think that this is another example of how things are running against the United States. And frankly, I don't see how they can avoid this situation. The only unbelievable tactic that might save them is simply renounce world leadership to the Chinese and or Russians. Well, Trump, although he certainly doesn't want to do this, his inept policies are having that effect anyway. And for example, China is now considered the leading country with regard to climate control. And there will be a forthcoming meeting on this subject, not in Washington or Paris, but in Beijing. So the decline of the United States seems to me, considering the American mentality, to be inevitable. And this is my final analysis and conclusion. It's not in the nature of the Judeo-Christian Islamic system to accept a stalemate situation at long term. Perhaps we will profit from such a situation, perhaps for one generation. The next 25 years, if we're lucky, there will be no war, but China will become increasingly powerful and increasingly, perhaps to a certain extent with Russia, the dominant world power. And I don't think that the homeland of the Judeo-Christian Islamic system, which is the United States, can accept this sort of situation. So therefore, I agree reluctantly with the article in the Financial Times that a war with China is inevitable. The only thing that would stop us is that China becomes so powerful that an American victory is no longer obvious, because just as we saw in the Second World War, the West retreated before Germany, as long as a victory was not obvious. It's only by the fact that Russia entered the war, that the eventual victory of the Western powers became obvious, and it's only then that the system became enthusiastic about the war. In any case, that Third World War will be a terrible event, and religious fanaticism seems to imply that, and it's a horrible thing to think about, but it's in the nature of the Judeo-Christian system to accept the possibility of destroying the human race. In other words, that the planet Earth would become uninhabitable by being radioactive and so forth, would accept this as an alternative to Chinese or Russo-Chinese domination of the world. It's probably the most dramatic condemnation that one could make of the Judeo-Christian Islamic system, that would rather destroy the world than to lose its competition with China. And it reminds one a little bit of the judgment of Solomon. If you don't remember what that was, two mothers were disputing whether the baby belonged to one mother or the other mother. And one mother said, Solomon offered to cut the baby in half and give one half to one mother and one half to the other. And one of the mothers said, yes, do that. And the other said, no, give the baby to the other mother. And Solomon said, that's the real mother who said, don't cut it in half, and he gave the baby to that mother. And I'm afraid we're in a situation where the Judeo-Christian Islamic system is the mother that prefers that the baby is cut in half, and that is that the human race will come to an end. I think that's a tragic conclusion, but it may be the one that we're facing. To sum up this fourth part, I remember what a man once told me. And it would seem my experience and events in the world justify his thoughts, which he said in the form of a little free rhyming poem. Here's what he told me. When evil decided to go out into the world, she dressed herself in the clothes of virtue and called herself God. And I'm afraid that events have proven that that pessimistic view is correct. Of course, I sincerely hope that things do not develop this way, and I invite everyone who will see this video to do what they can to stop it from happening, to accept the fact that China is running its country very well, and that fact qualifies it for world leadership. America is running the United States very badly, and for that reason it should accept a secondary role. Thank you for your attention.